We want to welcome you to our city of Fort Morgan in the wonderful state of Colorado. We are here to do a tour of the Fort Morgan Cemetery and visit some of the notable and some of the far less notable people that now live within these boundaries. This video is produced and directed by Abe Devin. My name is David Wood. I'm a lifelong resident of Fort Morgan, a graduate of the San Francisco College of Mortuary Science. Spent many years working with the funeral home, then joined the world of law enforcement. I'm considered the resident historian and expert on the cemetery within the Fort Morgan Museum. My mother loved cemeteries. She passed that along to me. I've been here my whole life. 4 of my 8 great-grandparents lay in cemetery plots behind me. The other 4 of them reside at the cemetery in Brush, a small community 10 miles east of us. Thought I'd give you a small history of the area. My back is south. I am facing the north. Within a half a mile north of me is the South Platte River. Along the South Platte River, hunters, trappers traveled into the mountains. In 1859, the Colorado Gold Strike occurred, and a trail rapidly developed along the South Platte River, called, of course, the South Platte River Trail. It followed the South Platte River. It came out of the river bottom proper about a half a mile west of us. This due to the fact that there's a restriction in the banks of the river, and it required the wagons to come up onto the flats here. With the gold strike, the Civil War, the soldiers of the United States Army were called back to the east. Colorado volunteers were established to help protect the settlers from the Native American Indian tribes that were a little less than happy with the conduct of the settlers that were invading their country. They first established a fort in Orchard. Orchard is a very small town 20 miles west of us along the river. Orchard is the site at which they filmed the miniseries Centennial. That fort didn't last long. They then came to this area and established Camp Wardell, which is either Wardell or Wardwell, and it's really hard to determine which it really was. They started building some sod and adobe buildings for housing at Camp Wardell. In 1864, the United States Army returned to the area, bringing with them troops that were, quote, called galvanized Yankees. These were Confederate soldiers paroled from prisoner of war camps who agreed to come west to fight and deal with the American Indian problem. They were promised they would never have to fight against their former comrades. They came in, took over Camp Wardell. The Colorado Volunteers basically disappeared and went back to their former mining jobs. That fort is about 3/4 of a mile east of us. That fort site is about 3/4 of a mile east of us. There were 3 sod barracks. There was a sod sutler's store. There was a sod office quarters and doctor's headquarters, and various other buildings, including a stable and corrals. The Army brought in and erected 3 wooden warehouses and a wooden framed commanding officer's home. Over the years, the fort did not last long. 5 soldiers died while serving at the fort. One of them in an accident with his horse, most of them from disease. One of the soldiers was killed in action against the Indians. They were buried somewhere. We're not really sure where. About a mile west of us, there is a hill. And as various travelers traveled down the South Platte River Trail, people would pass away from accident or from injury. They started toting them, if it was possible, to this site. And a cemetery was established on this high hill about 1/4 of a mile east of the fort. In 1867, the Inspector General of the United States Army came into town, toured and viewed the fort, issued an order that said that the 5 soldiers that were buried in this one plot would be disinterred and reburied on the hill with the kind of cemetery that was growing there. This was done. He also ordered that a fence be erected and that a guard would be posted on that cemetery. We shall go visit that hill, discuss that hill more. At any rate, I wish to welcome you to our Fort Morgan cemetery tour. Welcome. We are here at the United Presbyterian Church in Fort Morgan, affectionately known as the Church on the Hill. Over the many years that the fort operated as both the Colorado Volunteer Fort and as the United States Army Fort, settlers would die on the road, and if they could, people knew that the cemetery was here, and they brought in their dead and buried them on this hilltop. We are about 1 mile straight east of the Riverside Cemetery. When the town was established, there was already this cemetery here, so this became the community cemetery. At some point, a fellow homesteaded this property. He intended to farm it, so he asked the city to stop bringing people out and burying them on their property. That caused the drafting, the design, and the emplacement of the Riverside Cemetery. Many people were disinterred and moved to the new cemetery. Many people were not. Underneath the parking lot, there are an unknown amount of graves currently there, mostly of settlers that were passing by and just ended up buried on the hill. I have heard a story from a member that during the construction of the church, a grave was found underneath the building site. They simply ignored it, covered it back up, and poured their concrete. In 1867, the Inspector General of the United States Army passed through on a worldwide inspection tour, scoped out Fort Morgan, and issued some orders. Someplace there were 5 soldiers buried. One of them had been killed in action against Indians. The other 4 died of disease or accidents. We don't know where those 5 soldiers were originally buried. He ordered that they be disinterred, brought up here to this hill to join the other people on this hilltop. He ordered a fence to be erected around the cemetery and a 24-hour guard posted. In years past, the city was working on Nancy Street, which is the street to our east. As they were lowering the street level, they came across the remnants of a picket fence that had been buried over the years. Really strange story. One of the many houses that is on Nancy Street over there, or maybe one of the houses to our rear, they were installing it. A fellow was digging a trench for water line, sewer line, up, dropping out of his bucket a partial skeleton. This in the days before cell phones. He stopped what he was doing, probably took a couple of deep breaths, went and found a phone. In due course, probably very quickly, arrives the chief of police, the county sheriff, and they get a hold of Pat Jolliffe, who was our county coroner. Mr. Jolliffe knew that this was the original site of the original Fort Morgan Cemetery. He checked out the skeleton, which was clothed in fringed buckskin, and assumed that it was simply an original one of these burials. Mr. Jolliffe, being Mr. Jolliffe, told them to go ahead, finish the trench, lay their pipe. He stood there. They got ready. He pushed the skeleton back in the hole and covered it over. So, in one of these yards, there is a skeleton down laying with whatever pipe it is, to be rediscovered someday in the future, which was probably going to start the whole argument and the whole scene all over again. I have written a long letter about it to our current coroner so that there's information on file that it was found once before and left there. Cut. In 1868, when the United States Army left the fort, coming down from Greeley was a young man with his herd of sheep, and he started grazing his sheep in this area. He went back to Greeley during the winter. In 1869, he came back to Fort Morgan with a wagon with some building materials, and he started construction of a dugout home. His name was LaFayette More. Mr. Moore became the very first settler that stayed here in Fort Morgan. He lived in that small little house, started writing letters back to a young lady he knew back east. Her name was Effie, and in time she came on a train west. He got in a wagon, headed up to Cheyenne. They got married, and he moved her down into his little dugout, and there they lived. She eventually had a child. She went to Greeley to have it born. There weren't any ladies around to help her give birth locally, so their child was born in Greeley rather than here. Mr. Moore, his first name was Lafayette, and his wife eventually received awards from the city as being the original settlers, the most long-term settlers in the area. Mr. Moore died. Eventually, of course, Effie passed away. This is their family tombstone. As you'll notice, it says Moore. Then there are two footstones with their first names, Lafayette and Effie. This is a strange tombstone. Instead of one first name, there is her family, her parents are buried on the same tombstone, so their name is on the other side of this tombstone. Stafford. It's one of the few tombstones I've ever seen in the whole country with two family names on it. The other side of the Moore tombstone, the Stafford family, who were the parents of Effie, Her mother and father's footstones are just out of view below the camera. For many years, I would have brought you to this stone, to the grave of Ethel Rouse, who died in September 1884, and told you that this was the earliest death here in the cemetery. Found out she's not. We found an older grave. Ethel, who died at the age of 9 days, is buried here with her brother Albion, who died in 1897, was 17 years old. She would have originally been buried at the old Fort Cemetery a mile that way. This is the gravestone of Ida Williams, died at 6 months of age, the daughter of uh, Thomas and Nancy Williams, who happened to be buried here slightly to my rear. She would have originally been buried again at the old Fort Cemetery on the hill. This is the oldest grave that we are aware of in the cemetery. Again, she would have been buried there and brought here when this cemetery was started, and that one was closed. Member of the Greeley colony, Abner Baker, was a man who had been a veteran of the Civil War. He did several things following the Civil War, was a photographer. Then he got into the building of irrigation projects. He came to Colorado and built several irrigation projects throughout the state, dams, ditches. Lived in Greeley with the rest of his family. On one trip out to this part of the world, he decided that this would be an ideal location for an irrigation project. So he came out, started an irrigation project here, and decided that he would plot a town and call it Fort Morgan after the original fort that was here. This man was Abner Baker. We've always had a Baker school here in Fort Morgan. I would imagine that we will always have a Baker school here in Fort Morgan. Buried here with him are his mother and father, his son George, and his wife Dolly. George died in a hunting accident with another young man, and was killed with a gunshot wound at a very young age of about 16. Mr. Baker's whole family came with him. His sister is Kate Clatworthy. She is buried right back here to the rear of us. She married a man named William Clatworthy, who worked for Abner, and they founded the Clatworthy dynasty here in Fort Morgan. His brother lays straight back behind him. He was a farmer. Abner had probably tuberculosis, died at a fairly young age. He had spent so much money developing the city of Fort Morgan, the town of Fort Morgan, that for all intensive purposes, he died penniless. He had 3 surviving children, including Abner Baker Jr., who's right below the camera right now. Abner Baker Jr. grew up and became the county treasurer, served for 50, 60 years as the county treasurer, and handled the county funds here in Fort Morgan for Morgan County. Cut. Right next to Abner Baker is the Clatworthy family tombstone. Behind it are the footstones of his sister, Kate Baker, who married Henry William Clatworthy. William was born in England, probably became a member of the Greeley colony, and met Abner's sister, Kate. They founded the Clatworthy dynasty, the Clatworthy hardware stores and various things. One of their grandchildren had the first pizza parlor here in town, strangely called the Mouse's House for reasons I never understood. Kate was very involved in the establishment of this cemetery when the gentleman forbid them from burying any more people at the old cemetery. She, together with a group of women, designed this cemetery. You can look at a plot map. It is a flower petal. We are standing here in one of the petals of that flower. Originally, the office for the cemetery sat at the center section of this flower petal. When they built this cemetery, the river was perhaps closer to us than it is now, but trees were planted. Kate supervised and hired teenage boys to carry buckets of water from the river up the hill and here to the cemetery where they watered the trees. William had worked with her brother Abner, worked with him for a brief time as Abner had a general store, decided to go into business for himself. And the story is that he thought about everything, decided women's fashions went out of fashion, that food would spoil, that as long as he could keep the nails and the wire and the rope dry and out of the weather, the nails and rope and nuts and bolts would last forever. So Mr. Clatworthy started the Clatworthy hardware store, which existed forever in the community. Kate and her husband, William Henry. This is the grave of Abe Devin and his wife Lizzie, he was originally buried in the old cemetery. Then when it was closed, dug up and moved here. We can assume probably that this marker was at the original cemetery as well and was hauled down here. Abe Devin was the homesteader of the ground on which we stand. He had everything from Railroad, Riverview, to West Street, to Main Street, to Platt Avenue. This 360-acre tract was his farm. Abe passed away in 1886. I'm not sure why, but he passed away, leaving his wife in the farmhouse. She, not being able to figure she could handle it, contacted Abner Baker and traded the 368, this quarter of the town, to Mr. Baker for a house in the city proper. So he traded the house, a house that he had or whatever, and traded it to Lizzie for this 360 acres. Then when Kate needed a cemetery place, here was something that the Fort Morgan Town Company already owned, and this is where they located the Fort Morgan Riverside Cemetery. Just a quick overall lesson. 3 very young children. When you see a tombstone with a small sheep on top of it, a lamb, you can always assume it's a young girl. The sheep, the little lamb, signifying innocence. These 2 graves are 2 small children. Mr. Abner Baker went out in search of a doctor, found a young doctor just graduating from university, and talked him into coming to Fort Morgan to establish a medical practice. His name was Hubert Work. Hubert was married to a young lady named Laura Pinbuckle. They had children here. 2 of them passed away at a very young age, not an uncommon thing in those days. Dr. Work, perhaps because of the fact that the place had bad memories, left Fort Morgan, went to Pueblo, Colorado, and established a hospital named Woodcroft. Woodcroft eventually evolved into the Colorado State Hospital here in Colorado. Dr. Work eventually became head of the National Republican Party. He attempted to run in Colorado as a state senator and lost the election. but was appointed as the, excuse the notes, he was appointed as the Postmaster General of the state of the United States by President Harding. Served as the Postmaster General 1922 to 1923. Was then appointed as Secretary of the Interior by President Harding, and then reappointed by President Coolidge. One of the nationally famous, our tie to a nationally known sort of person here in the town of Fort Morgan. We should have mentioned, but Abner Baker and his family were ardent non-drinkers. Simply did not believe in the consumption of alcohol. One of the many things he did as he founded Fort Morgan was set up a rule that if you bought a piece of property, established a store, and then sold booze out of that store, your store and property would be forfeited back to the town. We were dry. Fort Morgan remained dry until 1959, when it was finally decided in a public election that we could actually buy liquor, alcoholic beverages here in town. This is the grave of Marshal, our town marshal, Charles Eyser, and his wife, Louise. September 30th, 1916, Marshal Eyser was out looking for a bootlegger. A couple of young men that were bringing alcoholic beverages into town. Marshal Eyser contacted him, let them go. They didn't have anything on him. A couple of hours later, he contacted them again outside of their apartment. A gunfight it followed. We're always a little unsure exactly who shot first, why. Marshal Eyser took a bullet, stumbled down a long, steep flight of stairs to the city street, and shortly thereafter passed away. The young man who shot him was named John Swan. Mr. Swan turned himself in later that evening, was arrested, confined to the city jail. Eventually a trial ensued, and John Swan was convicted of that crime. Sat in city jail. About a year, excuse me for the notes, on April 28th, 1917, John Swan escaped from the jail through a hole that was made in the roof and was never seen again, was never captured. The rest of the story is that John Swan went east, joined the United States Navy under an assumed name, changed his date of birth by 1 year, served in the Navy, eventually settled in Boston, Massachusetts, married, had children, lived his whole life through. John Swan eventually passed away in 1974 at the age of 80. He had 3 children, 7 grandchildren. We didn't know anything about this until, probably 20 years ago, when family ran their DNA tests through whichever service they used, upshowed a relationship to a Swan family in Colorado, which they didn't know anything about. So they started looking, and eventually everything got put together that their grandfather was John Swan, a man who'd killed the city marshal, lived a very exemplary life in the area of Boston, was a very loving family man. During this gun battle, one of the residents upstairs above this, where this Mr. Swan had his apartment, his room, a lady came to the door and was listening through the door when the gunfight started. A bullet went through the door, struck her in the head, and she fell dead as well. We're not sure to this day exactly whose bullet killed her. We're pretty sure it was probably Mr. Swan's. As I mentioned, the Baker family became a Baker family affair. Another one of Abner's brothers was Lyman Baker. In Greeley, he had worked at a print shop, helped produce the Greeley newspaper, came out to Fort Morgan with his brother, very quickly established a newspaper here in the city, became the Fort Morgan Times. The Fort Morgan Times was continuously published until just a couple of months ago, when it was changed over to a weekly newspaper called the Morgan County Times. His brother Lyman and his wife Helen buried here in the same cemetery with his brother. We're standing here at the preeminent tombstone in the Fort Morgan Cemetery, the one that is the largest, most obvious tombstone that is in the cemetery. You'll recall that we visited the You will recall that we stopped and talked about a young man named LaFayette More, our original Port Morgan settler. Into town came a young man. Into town came a young man named Moncellus More and his family, this to visit his brother LaFayette. Moncellus was a businessman back in Pennsylvania and came out to visit his brother LaFayette, stayed at Lafayette's dugout, came in and out of town, liked the looks of the town, was around for some period of time, and then had to return to Pennsylvania to settle his business affairs there. He returned to Fort Morgan and established the first Morgan County Bank here in the county. Eventually, Moncellus' wife passed away. Her body was taken back to Pennsylvania. She did not like this cemetery, which did not have trees or nice green grass. She wished to return home. So they returned her body back to Pennsylvania. Moncellus' daughter, Susan, stayed with him, worked in the bank. Into town came a young man named Julian Roediger. He'd stopped by the bank to probably cash a check. Got to meet a young girl working the teller window named Susan. And they sort of clicked. In time, Mr. Roediger married Susan. We're going to backtrack a bit. Moncellus bought 5 acres. This would be outside of town. And he built his house on the east side of the block. He sold the other half of that 5-acre section, the west part of it, to his brother LaFayette. Lafayette built a house on his half of that property. His half still stands. It's been changed a little bit, but it's basically still there. Julian Roediger and Susan were married. Moncellus was elected and served as mayor of the town. In 1912, in 1912, the night patrolman of the city smelled smoke, tracked it down to the Moore home, and found that home on fire. He did get into the house and was able to drag Moncellus' body outside of the house before it became totally engulfed. However, Moncellus passed away and died of smoke inhalation and probably some burns. It appears that Moncellus liked to have a drink or two at night, even though it was a dry city. He had preferred to smoke his cigars in bed. That was the probable cause of the fire, although nobody's for sure. With the death of Moncellus, Herman Roediger now became the owner of the Morgan County Bank. Pays to marry the boss's daughter. Julian and Susan had some children. Julia Roediger, who was born in 1904, lived for 9 days before she passed away. I would point out the lambs on top of her tombstone, a normal, typical sort of thing. They then had another daughter, Virginia, born a couple of years after her sister Julia had passed away. Julian cleaned up the mess of his father's old house, which was wood framed, and built a new house, a large brick. Well, for Fort Morgan, it's our mansion. The house is designed and built with concrete floors, concrete walls. Every door is a fire door. Julian evidently was afraid his house would catch fire. Virginia went off, eventually obtained three separate doctorate degrees. Is the author of the basic work on Southwest Indian art, native art. It's the definitive work. It's one of her areas of expertise. Julian divorced Susan. Susan and her daughter Virginia traveled extensively, lived at various places, Southern California. They became friends with people from the movie industry and the music world. She eventually married Carl Johnson. With the death of her father in 1951, Virginia became the owner of what was then the First National Bank, and all of his various property and assets. She and her husband lived in the mansion. they were unable to have children themselves, but they adopted several children, mostly children with special needs. Susan, Sarah, some of the other people buried right here were adopted children. Most of them did not live terribly long lives. Julian has a reputation within town of being a really rotten human being. The massive, prominent tombstone within the cemetery was without a doubt Julian's idea. He had to be one bigger, one better than anybody else. There were people within the community that believed Julian probably was instrumental in starting the fire that killed his father. I can't say that. I don't know that. It's definitely never been proven. But there were people that believed that. This is the final resting place of all of these people. Julian is not buried here. He is in a mausoleum vault at Fairmont in Denver. We come to visit the grave, the tombstone commemorating the life of General James E. Jewell, commander of the Grand Army of the Republic. Grand Army of the Republic was an organization like the VFW or the American Legion for the soldiers that had fought on the Union side of the Civil War. I've only ever found one gravesite here in the Fort Morgan Cemetery of a Confederate soldier. The Grand Army of the Republic had various ranks, very military orientated. So a local chapter would have officers that held the rank of captain or lieutenant or whatever it was. As they rose through the levels of the GAR, their rank continued to rise. General Jewell is actually buried in Arlington National Cemetery. He does not rest here. He was buried in Arlington. General Jewell was born back east, served in the Union Army, was discharged, became a lawyer. Sometime in the middle of his life, he came west to Colorado to establish a better living for himself and wanted to raise cattle. Ended up in Fort Morgan. He had a law practice here as well, and served. Eventually, In 1930, 1931, he was elected commander of the National Organization of the Grand Army of the Republic and became General Jewel. He's buried in Arlington. His wife is buried here, and a son is buried here. He's in Arlington. I want to read, and I will read this directly from a publication of the Grand Army of the Republic. I will quote, Mr. Jewel enlisted with the Union Army in Company C, 27th Iowa Infantry, October 27th, 1864, just past 17 years old. He served as color guard all of the time he was in the Army and was honorably discharged November 17th, 1864. It puts him in the United States Army for 20 days from the time he enlisted to the time he was discharged. He served in the color guard. He marched around for 20 days carrying a flag. Eventually rose to the rank of general. I think it's just something to make you smile. As with Marshal Eyser, not all of the stories of everybody at rest in this cemetery are good stories. We're here at the grave of Helen Mura. Next to her are her parents, Ignacio and Sabina Mura. Helen was born in Italy, was brought to the United States as a very young child, and her parents settled in Weldona, small town 16 miles west of us along the South Platte River. It was an Italian-orientated community, and there they were at home. Helen attended college, became a school teacher. Her father hired a young man, Stabio, also from Italy. And Stabio very much fell deeply in love with Helen, who was evidently a very attractive young woman. Helen did not reciprocate Stabio's feelings. She was teaching in a one-room schoolhouse, the North Star School, this some 6 miles outside of Weldona. She went to school one morning, found Stabio outside the door, and sent one of the boys on his horse down to Weldona, 6 miles away, to get her mother to come up to the school. Stabio and her talked, perhaps. Um, he entered the school. The students are gathered throughout the classroom. Stabio pulls out a gun and shoots Helen in the head, then puts the gun against his own head and commits suicide. Students barreled through the windows, fled the school as fast as possible, of course. He was buried here in the cemetery as well. They put him as far away from her as they could when they buried him. He's way off that a ways, as far as they could get him. Sad story. We have talked about John Swan, who was the fellow that got into a gunfight with Marshal Charles Eyser. His family stayed in Fort Morgan. This is the grave of John's parents, Elmer and Millie Swan. I always stop by this tombstone. For some reason, it's my favorite tombstone in the cemetery. Just the design and the style of it, the unfinished sort of work that's going on with it. Hubert Work, the fellow who became Postmaster General and Secretary of the Interior of the United States, talked to one of his cousins, and his cousin, at a really old age, decided to come to Fort Morgan. He was a Presbyterian. The Presbyterian Church has two branches, the First Presbyterian and the United Presbyterian. At that point in time, Fort Morgan only had one of the two branches. Mr. Work was from the other branch. So when he came to Fort Morgan, he simply built his own church. With him came his family, all of them. He brought his sons with him. You'll be able to tell from this photograph of Josiah and his family that Josiah was probably not a man that you wanted to mess with. He's pretty sort of stern looking. Eventually, he passed away in 1909. He was rather elderly when he came here, but his family lived on forever within the community. Vast numbers of them became school teachers. I had one of his kin, Janet Work, who was a 5th grade school teacher. In high school, his kin, Elizabeth, taught history, taught English, taught French. A vast, huge family that existed forever here in the community of Fort Morgan. The grave of Janet Work fifth grade school teacher, and the grave of Elizabeth Work, high school teacher here in Fort Morgan. All of this is the Work family. Some married, but all of these that's in this area are all descendants from Josiah Work. Well, give me a minute, we'll find it. Uh, if you drive by the city of Fort Morgan on the interstate, you might notice the signs on the interstate that talk about boyhood home of Glenn Miller. Glenn Miller, big band leader era of the 1930s into the Second World War. Glenn Miller was born in Iowa, I believe. Came here as a young teenager with his parents. Grew up here in the city of Fort Morgan. Learned to play the trombone. Did not attend his own high school graduation because he had a gig someplace with a small band that he had. Glenn Miller became a band leader with an army band during Second World War. To save you deep research, he took off from England one day on a plane to go to France, preparing to do a band concert for the troops in France. The plane disappeared, was never seen again, somewhere over the English Channel. After his father's death in 1936, Mr. Miller bought his mother a house, and she then moved into the house and lived there until her death in 1963. That house sits in the block where the Safeway store now sits. Was one of the houses demolished so that the Safeway store could be built. There's stories about him sitting on the roof of the schools playing his trombone. Anyway, the graves of Glenn Miller's parents. This corner of the cemetery behind me was basically the original Potter's Field. That area where if you were without funds, the city would bury you in, quote, Potter's Field. We're standing here at the grave of Maggiorino Stabio, an Italian farmhand who killed the school teacher named Helen Mura and then committed suicide. This is his grave. As far as they could get him from where Helen was laid to rest. The woman here in the Fort Morgan Cemetery who died of curiosity. Maria Weimer, who was present in her own home, her own apartment, when Marshal Eyser and John Swan had their gunfight. She was listening at the door, trying to find out what was going on, when a bullet went through the door, struck her in the head, and she was dead by the time she hit the floor. She and her husband ran the cafe that was on the ground floor under the apartments. Maria Catherine Weimer. To quote one of our country's leading science fiction writers, angels and demons live in all of us, and sometimes the demons win. This is the grave of George, and we think Pauline and Lydia Bath, or Bott. Bott, B-O-T-T, is the German spelling of Bath. If you get into the old newspapers, you will sometimes read it as Bath, B-A-T-H. June of 1924, the Bass family was working as a farm laborer, farmhand. Had a large family. 2 daughters, Lydia, who is 16, a girl named Mary, and sons, George, Charles, Henry, Jacob, William, Edward, and Daniel, all living in a small farmhouse. Father George evidently came in out of the barn one morning while they ate breakfast, chopped his daughter Lydia, his wife Pauline, in the head with an axe, attacked his daughter Mary. The boys fled, went to a neighbor's, called the police, never went after the boys. He then went out to the barn, slit his wrists, and hung himself from a rafter. When the sheriff got there, George was dead in the barn. Lydia, 16-year-old girl, was dead at the scene. His wife was badly injured. She was brought to the Fort Morgan Hospital. His youngest daughter, Mary, also was brought to the Fort Morgan Hospital. Pauline lived a couple of days before she passed away. Mary was transported to a Denver hospital where she slowly recovered, was sent home, ended up back into the hospital, sent home again, sent home being to one of the Denver relatives. Mary eventually simply passed away. Mary ended up buried in the Riverside Cemetery in Denver, the old original cemetery that's in Denver. Nobody survived it that could explain I had this sneaking suspicion in my life that something was going on. Pauline would have been 45 years old. Their youngest son, Daniel, was 2. It's not impossible for a 43-year-old woman to give birth. But it seemed to me maybe a little unlikely. So I started in my brain assuming that there was something going on between daughter Lydia. Some years ago, a granddaughter showed up from Texas who was related through one of the boys. She was tracking down this story and family. Her story was that it was very much sexually orientated. The best belief is that Lydia had announced that she was pregnant, maybe for the second time, and was going to give birth to another child in the future, which sent father over the edge. And at that point, he simply started doing away with all of his female kin. Like I said, angels and demons live in all of us. And sometimes the demons win. Good. We're standing here at the grave of James K. Brown and his family, his wife Mary, and a daughter, very young daughter, Ella, who passed away at the age of 4 or 5 months. James Brown was perhaps the second person to arrive in this area. He didn't stay. James Brown was born in California at a gold mining camp. His father died when he was very young, and his mother and the rest of his siblings left the gold mining camp. At the young age of 12, he was part of a horse herding team that brought horses from the California area to Colorado. He was probably a Mary being a young man who worked for a camp, did the dishes, gathered buffalo chips for the campfire, just did all the little odd jobs that nobody else wanted to do. Once he got to Colorado, he hired on to a buffalo hunting troop. At the age of 12, he came into the area, which was now Fort Morgan. On one morning, one of the hunters in the troop changed rifles, took his rifle that he owned, and gave him an old German Jaeger rifle, a muzzle-loading, very large caliber rifle, and left him in camp. At the age of 12, a small group of buffalo came into town, into the area. He then shot and killed 3 buffalo, One of them very close to the intersection of Platte and Main. The other two in areas very close around that area, within a couple of blocks of Platte and Main. He then left. He returned to the area 4 years later in 1874, running and in charge of his own buffalo hunting excursion. And they hunted the area south of us. On one particular day, he had a stand going and killed 84 buffalo in one day. He was again gone. He returned to the area, used to play the violin. Well, it wasn't called a violin, it was called a fiddle. He played a fiddle at the community dances. Met a young woman, married her, had a small family. James Brown was also elected the sheriff of Morgan County, served a couple of terms in the very early part of the 1900s, and then eventually passed away in 1925. Cut. People around the world know the name Fort Morgan, Colorado. I think you can go to any country, anywhere in the world, and if you could ask the entire population, you would find somebody that knew the name of Fort Morgan, Colorado. And they know that name because of the man whose ashes rest here in this grave. Philip K. Dick. Mr. Dick's parents grew up in the area, met, fell in love, married. Mr. Dick graduated from college. Mr. Dick's father graduated from college, became a member of the U.S. Government Department of Agriculture. He was stationed in Chicago when his wife gave birth to twins. One of them was Jane, the other one was Philip. These children were born failure to thrive in our day and age. Jane passed away a month, 40 days after her birth. Philip survived. Jane's body was then shipped back to Fort Morgan, Colorado, where she was buried next to her grandma, Bessie Dick. Philip then went on to spend time and grew up in California. They spent time in Washington, D.C. area, moving around as his father was transferred from one place to another. Eventually, his parents divorced. He spent most of his life living with his mother back in California, where she enjoyed it. Became an author of science fiction, published lots of stories in science fiction magazines under several different pen names. Was never a great success as an author. He always ended up having to do other things in order to put bread on the table. At some point, Hollywood found one of his stories, converted it to a movie script, The story they found was a small story he'd written entitled Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? That was far too big a name to put on a marquee, of course. So the name was changed to Blade Runner. Mr. Dick was invited into the Hollywood studio, got to watch rushes, some of the filming they had done of the movie already, was very happy to have seen this sort of thing, was satisfied with the way they were filming his story. He left. That night or the next, Mr. Dick suffered a stroke, was hospitalized, did not recover, and eventually passed away within a fairly short period of time. His father then had him cremated and sent his ashes back to rest with his sister Jane here at the Fort Morgan Cemetery. As you can see, there is a constant group of people that stop to visit this. From all over the world. The cemetery has library cards from all over the world that have been left here. They can clean this out, and they do rather often. They clean all this up. 2 days later, there will be other stuff here upon this tombstone. Some of the stories he wrote became more movies after the success of Blade Runner. His story, We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, became the movie Total Recall. Other stories have been filmed. A Minority Report, A Scanner Darkly, Screamers have all been made into various movies. Mr. Dick's estate, and he never lived very well. He was always, if you will, on the lower end of an income scale, became highly successful, and his estate became highly valuable. But the resting place of the one man in the Fort Morgan Cemetery who is known worldwide. We've come to the grave of Ivo Dyer and her sister Buna. These young ladies were born in Kansas. At a very early age, their father moved the family to Ray, Colorado. Ray, if you check your atlas, is a very small town that sits way to the east of us along the Kansas border. Ivo went off to college with a desire to become a nurse. She became a nurse. Eventually, she and her sister moved to Fort Morgan. Ivo then started the first hospital here in Fort Morgan. It was in a house along Sherman Street. That house still stands. It's been changed a little bit, so the picture you see of the house is not exactly how it looked when she was running a hospital out of it. She eventually wore out. She left the area and worked for a long time at reservations for Native American Indians. Various doctors tracked her down and talked her into coming back to Fort Morgan, which she did. Along with her, she brought her son that she had either given birth to or adopted. Nobody really knows. She never married. She came into town. The Great Western Sugar Company had built, when they were doing the factory, they had built a dormitory for the workers. They no longer used the dormitory for its intended purposes. Ivo Dyer contacted the Great Western Sugar Company. They agreed to rent her that building. She rented it and converted it into Fort Morgan's second hospital. That served as our hospital until Fort Morgan built its first real, from the ground up hospital. And then that was closed down as the hospital of the time. Ivo eventually passed away in the nursing wing of the Fort Morgan Hospital, the new Fort Morgan Hospital, in 1968. A lovely, very notable woman from our past. Good. We are not standing at a specific gravesite because I am not able to take you to a specific gravesite in the area behind me. That record's been lost of exactly where that gravesite was. December 3rd, 1988, a farmer and his son, a rancher and his son, operating a ranch way south and west of Fort Morgan, were out in their pastures, saw a plume of smoke. They went to investigate, not wanting to get a range fire going, found an object laying in the barrel pit of the road, burning. They got out. The son grabbed a shovel, tossed a couple of shovelfuls of dirt on this burning object at about the same time that the father realized what was laying there. He stopped his son. His son was sent to the house to call the sheriff. What was laying there burning was the headless, handless body of a woman who'd been doused in diesel fuel and lit a fire. As you can imagine, various law enforcement agencies, including me, responded. Eventually, an autopsy was held on what was left of the body. Pat Jolliffe, the county coroner and the owner of the funeral home, eventually buried her in a plot owned by the county, in a plot somewhere in the area behind us. She was simply a Jane Doe. One of the cemetery employees went home with his plasma cutter and a sheet of metal and made a wonderful and very beautiful tombstone in the shape of a cross with Jane Doe and the date, and erected that piece of metal as a tombstone over her body. Over a period of time, they started getting a glimmer of who she was. She laid here in her grave, unidentified as a Jane Doe, while various agencies, including Denver Metropolitan Police agencies, worked. Eventually, a concept came about as to who she was. From her family, a hairbrush was obtained with hair samples, and she was identified as Karen Pineda Nelson. When she was identified as Karen Pineda Nelson, her family had her disinterred. She was reburied in Denver with other family members. It's not such a wonderful story, except for the fact that Karen Pineda Nelson was the first person in the state of Colorado identified through the use of DNA. As such, she became rather a historical figure. One of the early people in the United States identified through the use of DNA. And now we'll head off to do the last couple of graves we're going to visit. There are various tombstones throughout this cemetery, as there are many others that are constructed like this. We just happened to find out this one wasn't attached to the base. No, you can't see the name. It's hollow. It's made out of bronze. These became very popular with a certain group of people during Prohibition. They would unscrew these, pick out a pack of money, deposit the bottles of alcohol within this tombstone, screw the panel back on, and leave. Then the man who'd bought the bottle and left the money would stop by and pick up his bottle of booze. And then at a certain point, he'd make another phone call, go deposit some more money in the back of these tombstones. And that would be a way to transport alcohol during Prohibition from the bootlegger to the final recipient. We're sorry, no, you can't see the name on it. We bring you to the grave of William Rickel and his wife Gertrude. William was a member He was a corporal in Company C of the 1st Colorado Cavalry. It was the volunteer cavalry set up. William was also a Pony Express rider. He evidently never rode the main trails of the Pony Express, but he might do a run from, say, Cheyenne to Denver on a side leg of the Pony Express. William was, while with the Colorado Cavalry, participated in the battle at Glorieta Pass in New Mexico when the Confederates intended to invade Colorado. Based upon his company designation, William probably was part of the group that was sent to surround and flank the Confederate forces, and then stumbled upon Apache Canyon, where the Confederates had their supply wagons. They then captured them, took what they wanted, and set the Confederate supplies on fire. When their supply wagons went up in smoke, the battle was over because the Confederates no longer had any ammunition or food, clothing. William also, as part of the Colorado Volunteer Cavalry, participated in Sand Creek and was wounded at Sand Creek. Eventually, he settled here as a farmer. One of his sons served as mayor of Fort Morgan. He had a lovely wife who survived him. And we're going to let you see a picture of his wife riding a horse in a parade here in Fort Morgan in her 80s. William Rickle, one of the notable people of our history. Now we're on our way to one more grave. We come to the grave of Laura Forbes. Laura was married twice. Her maiden name was Ingalls, as in Charlie Ingalls, as in Little House on the Prairie Ingalls. This is the sister of Charles Ingalls, father of Laura Ingalls Wilder. She married twice. Second husband passed away. She moved in with her son into a home between Roggan and Kingsburg, which is 40 or 50 miles west of us. She eventually passed away in 1918. We have absolutely no idea why she is buried here in Fort Morgan. Nobody else has an idea of why she's buried here in Fort Morgan. For the record, her name was Laura, which is the mother's name, which was her mother's name as well, Ladocia Ingalls was her maiden name. If you want to get into the books of the series of Little House on the Prairie, written by Laura Ingalls Wilder, in the follow-up books you will find this woman mentioned several times. This is Aunt Dosha. Her family searched for years for this grave and finally just stumbled upon it while searching Fort Morgan. Again, we have no idea why she ended up buried here in Fort Morgan, but here Aunt Dosha rests. We're off to another grave. Cut, yes. Oh shit. Ah. Well, you know, shoot, might even work within the little film as we giggle. Fort Morgan, as does almost every cemetery anywhere, has a veterans section. If you're a veteran, you would find this to be a rather poor excuse for a veterans section. It's not lined up with military precision. Graves go here, graves go there. Um, it's just kind of not something that ever seemed to catch on in Fort Morgan, the military section. Down in the original end of the graves are veterans of the Civil War, of the Spanish-American War. The more modern graves are Korea, World War II, Vietnam veterans. This statues and stones, the flagpoles were all recent additions. For some years, we had a small, privately owned military museum here in town. This was a statue that he erected in his front yard. When he closed his military museum, it came to the city as a donation and was erected here with the flagpoles of the to commemorate our military section. City donates to any veteran the property or the ground on which his grave will sit. And they are starting now to make a little more military precision in the way that the graves are laid out. They still wander a little bit, but nobody wants to go back and start over and dig up veterans of the Civil War and rebury them in a far more military fashion. Anyway, our military section of the Fort Morgan Cemetery. A tree long since departed and replaced, erected by the Women's Relief Corps, which was the women's organization of the Grand Army of the Republic. This honoring James E. Jewell, General James E. Jewell, who was Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Army of the Republic. The Women's Relief Corps also erected a fountain that no longer is a fountain, erected by the Women's Relief Corps, again, the women's auxiliary branch of the Grand Army of the Republic, people who had served on the Union side within the American Civil War. They put this in to mark our veterans section. There is no year on when they erected it, but this would have been done fairly early on, probably as late as the 1920s. It stopped working as a fountain and just now gathers bark and rocks, but still here to honor veterans of the Civil War. Well, we've completed our tour of some of the graves here at the Fort Morgan Riverside Cemetery. There are some 7,000 bodies and cremains that rest here within this cemetery. Every one of them has a story. In most cases, we simply don't know that story. But I'm sure that if we dug, we could find 7,000 stories of interest within this cemetery. You've managed to see some very, very few of those people that rest here in the cemetery and hear some of their stories. I thank you for coming and joining us on this tour of the Fort Morgan Riverside Cemetery.